The days blurred together, not in the way that pleasant days blur, where you look up and a week has passed because you were happy, but because they were all the same wooden ceiling, the same straw mattress, the same bowl of thin broth, the same two faces leaning over her with mouths moving and sounds coming out, and none of it landing anywhere that mattered. Sarah counted the days by the light. Dawn came through the gap in the shutters, gray and thin. Midday was warm on her face when Mara opened the window to let the air in. Evening was the smell of smoke and cooking, and the creak of Bram's boots on the packed earth floor. Night was the settling of the house, the groan of old wood, and the distant bark of some animal out in the fields that she could never quite identify. She slept, she ate, she stared at the ceiling, and occasionally she cried quietly into the rough wool of the blanket, and then she stopped, and then she stared at the ceiling some more. On the 9th day, she understood her first word. Bram was carrying water in from the well, and he set the bucket down and wiped his hands on his trousers and said something, a short sound of 2 syllables, and then he pointed at the bucket, then at her, then made a drinking motion with his hand, and Sarah looked at the bucket and looked at his face and said the word back. It came out wrong, too flat, too clipped, the vowels sitting in her mouth like stones that didn't belong there. But Bram nodded and smiled and said it again, and she said it again, and something in her chest loosened by. A fraction, one word, one anchor in the dark, one thread connecting her to a world she did not belong to. The language came in pieces, not in lessons, not in structured practice, but in fragments, in the small transactions of survival. Mara would hold up a root vegetable and say a word, and Sarah would repeat it, and Mara would point at the fire and say another word, and Sarah would repeat it. Then Bram would come in from the fields muddy and sweating and say 3 words that Sarah had learned to parse as meaning he was hungry right now. And she would nod, because nodding was still easier than speaking, and because nodding did not require her to open her mouth and produce sounds that were almost but never quite the sounds she remembered. By the 3rd week she could form sentences, bad ones, clumsy halting constructions that sounded like a child's first attempt at speech, with the grammar wrong half the time and the verb endings a mess and the vowels sitting in her mouth like she was chewing on them rather than speaking them. But people understood her mostly, and she understood them enough, and that was the thing that hurt most about the whole wretched business. Not that the language was foreign, but that it was almost familiar, like hearing your own voice on a recording pitched slightly wrong, or seeing a childhood photograph of yourself and not quite knowing who you were looking at. The consonants had shifted over the centuries. The diphthongs had collapsed into simpler shapes, and 3,000 years of mouths shaping and reshaping the same sounds had worn them smooth like river stones, until what emerged on the other side was recognizable but not the same. Never the same, never going to be the same again. She caught herself listening for the old forms, waiting for a hard consonant where they used a soft one, waiting for the triple vowel constructions of academic speech, the careful precision of a language that had been designed for science and law and poetry all at once. They were never coming. The language had moved on. The people had moved on, and she was the only one left who remembered what the words used to sound like before time had ground them down. Mara was the one who pushed, and Bram was the one who let her be. Bram was content to let Sarah sit, to let her heal, to let her exist in the small, quiet space of their house without demanding anything of her. He brought her food, he mended the roof when it leaked, he sat in the evenings and whittled small shapes from wood and did not ask her to speak if she did not want to. And there was a kindness in that, a patience that Sarah did not know she needed until she had it. Mara was different. Mara had questions and expectations and a way of looking at you that made you feel like she was reading the text beneath your skin. And she looked at Sarah with those sharp, assessing eyes and decided, correctly, that this woman was not merely injured but was hiding something vast and terrible behind a wall of silence. "What are you running from?" Sarah shook her head. You are not from here, not from this village, not from this region. Your hands are wrong. Your posture is wrong. You hold yourself like someone who has never done physical labor in her life. But you are not soft. You are not pampered. You are tired in a way that has nothing to do with sleep and everything to do with carrying something too heavy for one person. Sarah looked at her hands, at the healing burns, at the fading scar on her left palm from a laboratory accident 11 years ago. 11 years in a world that no longer existed, and she chose her words carefully, because choosing words in the language you barely spoke required a kind of attention that kept the grief at arm's length. I was in a war, she said, slowly, carefully, building each word like a brick. There was fighting. I was hurt. Someone put me in a place of safety, and I do not know how I got here. Mara studied her, did not believe her, did not push further, but her eyes said clearly enough that she knew Sarah was lying, and that she would wait, and that the waiting would end eventually. Bram talked more than Mara. Not to Sarah at first, but to himself, to the animals, to the air, narrating his own life in a low, constant murmur that Sarah lay in bed and listened to, letting the words seep in like water through cloth, filling the gaps in her comprehension one small piece at a time. He talked about the fields and the grain and the weather, about whether the rains would come early this year, about the neighbor's goat that kept escaping into his cabbage patch, about the road to the south and whether the merchants would come through before the frost set in. And it was all so ordinary, so small, so rooted in the earth and the seasons and the simple rhythms of a life lived close to the ground, that it made Sarah ache in a way she could not name, because she was listening, truly listening, and in the listening she was cataloging, and what she found in the catalog was absence. No word for electricity. She waited for it, listened for it, some term for power or current, or the hum of the grid that had underpinned every aspect of her civilization. Nothing. Bram spoke of fire and oil and candlelight, of the sun and the wind and the turning of the seasons, and of nothing else. No word for engine, no word for vehicle beyond cart and wagon, no word for any metal that was not iron, copper, or bronze. No word for city in the way she meant it, because Bram had a word for the market town 2 days south, and a word for Camelin which he spoke with a kind of distant reverence, the way someone might say a name that belonged to a story rather than a place, but nothing that meant the sprawling, luminous, humming metropolises she had grown up in. No word for university, for laboratory, for quantum, for gravitational, for any of the 10,000 concepts that had filled her days, for 11 years of study and research and teaching. Gone, all of it, not destroyed, not forgotten in the way that things are forgotten when no one writes them down, but simply never existed as far as this world was concerned, worn away by 3,000 years of erosion, and breaking and slow grinding, forgetting until nothing remained but folk wisdom and hand tools and a language that had forgotten its own roots. The night Sarah understood the word breaking, she did not sleep. Mara had used it in passing, a casual reference before the breaking, after the breaking, the way someone might say before the war or after the plague, a fixed point in history, a line drawn across time that everyone knew about and no one questioned. Sarah had asked, slowly, carefully, what was the breaking? And Mara had looked at her strangely, as if she had asked what the sun was, as if the answer were so obvious that the question itself was suspect. And then she had said, the breaking, the time when the world broke, when the men who could channel went mad and tore the earth apart, when the seas changed and the mountains moved and every city fell. Sarah had sat very still at the table with her hands wrapped around a cold cup of tea, and she had felt the stone in her chest grow heavier because she knew what the breaking was. She knew because she had been alive when it had not yet happened, because in her time, Sedai had been clean and safe, a tool like any other, studied and regulated and woven into every aspect of civilization, and in her time there had been no breaking, no madness. No slow centuries of men going insane and burning the world down around them. And now it was not, and no one remembered why, and no one remembered that it had ever been different, and the world had rebuilt itself on the bones of the Old One, and called it progress, and called the Old One legend, and called the power that had built it dangerous, and called the people who wielded it servants, and then made them serve or die. She lay in the dark and did the arithmetic. The breaking had happened after her time, after the stasis box, after the war. The men had gone mad. They had destroyed everything, and then 3,000 years had passed, and the dust had settled and people had rebuilt, and they had rebuilt wrong, smaller, lower, with wood where there had been crystal, with iron where there had been composites, with candlelight where there had been stars captured in glass. She pressed her face into the straw mattress and breathed in, out, in, out. And she did not scream, because she had decided somewhere in the first week that she would not scream, because screaming was for people who expected someone to come, who expected help, who expected the world to make sense again. And the world was not going to make sense again. Bram told her about the box on a Tuesday, but what passed for a Tuesday in a household that measured time by the rhythm of the fields and the quality of the light rather than by numbered days on a calendar. They were eating, the three of them, around the small wooden table with the uneven legs, and Sarah's comprehension was good enough now to follow a conversation if it was slow and simple and the speakers did not use too many idioms. And Bram was talking about the field, about the strange patch of ground at the tree line where nothing grew, where the grass was wrong, where the earth was scorched in a circle, as if something very hot had touched it very briefly and then vanished. "I found you there," Bram said, in the flat, simple way he said everything, without drama, without expectation, just stating the shape of the world as he had found it. "In the grass, at the edge of the burn. You were not breathing right, and I thought you were dead." Sarah set down her spoon. "And the box?" Bram's hand tightened on his cup, and he did not look at her, and Mara went still beside him, and the fire crackled in the hearth and filled the silence. "There was a box," Bram said, "in the ground, half buried, metal or something like metal, smooth, no seams, no marks, nothing I had ever seen anything like. And it opened, and there were lights, and a voice speaking in a strange language, the same language you speak, and I thought I had disturbed some ancient curse, but then it opened fully, and you came out. You were hurt. You just passed out right there in the grass, and I grabbed you and brought you home and called for Mara." He set his cup down and did not touch it again. "I have not gone back," he said, "and I do not want to be entangled in a Sedai business." The word landed like a stone dropped into still water. Sedai. Sarah knew it. Of course she knew it. In her time, it was what she was, what Kale was, what everyone was who could channel and chose to use that gift in service of the world, a title earned through decades of work and sacrifice and the slow accumulation of wisdom. Here it meant something else. She could hear it in the way Bram said it, in the way he pulled his shoulders in the way his eyes flicked to the window as if expecting someone to be watching, as if the word itself were a summons. "It's Sedai," Sarah repeated, and her voice came out quieter than she intended. "What are they here?" Bram and Mara exchanged a look, and it was Mara who answered, because Mara always answered the hard questions, the ones that needed precision and honesty and a willingness to say the thing that was true rather than the thing that was comfortable. "Women who can channel," Mara said. "They live in Tarvalon, in the White Tower. They advise kings. They meddle in the affairs of nations. They are feared and respected and not loved, and they do not take kindly to those who claim their title without their permission." Sarah absorbed this. Let it settle. Let it find its place in the architecture of what she was learning about the world. Women only, not men, because the men had gone mad, because the men had broken the world. And now only women channeled, only women held the title, only women were trusted with the power. 3,000 years of trauma, compressed into a single institutional rule that no one questioned, because questioning it meant remembering what had come before and no one remembered what had come before.
And the men,
Sarah asked.
the ones who can channel.
Silence, Bram staring at his cup, Mara's jaw tightening, the fire crackling. They are gentle, Mara said, cut off from the power, and then they die, slowly, within a few years, and it is considered mercy. Sarah did not respond. She picked up her spoon and ate the last of her broth and set the spoon down, and she thought of Kale, of his hands on Sedai, of the way he wove in battle, precise and brutal and beautiful, of the way he had laughed when she told him his shoulder muscles were ridiculous, of the way he had leaned down to whisper things in her ear that made her pretend to be outraged before grabbing his hand and dragging him toward the exit. Gentle, cut off, left to die, called mercy. He thought of the Grand Council, of the 300 seats filled with A's Sedai in their official white, of Tel Janine standing at the podium with his voice ringing out over the chamber, arguing for the war effort, arguing for survival, arguing for the right of every person who could channel to use that gift in service of the world. Gone. All of it. 3,000 years of progress and knowledge and civilization ground down to nothing, and in its place a world that feared its own gifts, that executed its children for the crime of being born with a connection to the power, that called it mercy and meant it. Sarah finished her broth, thanked them for the meal, went to her room, closed the door, and for the second time since waking, she wept, not quietly this time, not into the blanket, but standing in the middle of the small, wooden room with her whole body shaking, the sound tearing out of her throat in ugly broken sobs that she could not stop and did not try to stop. She wept for Kale, for the Grand Council, for Adanza, for the university where she had taught, for the coffee shop on the corner of 5th and Meridian, where she had argued with colleagues about quantum field theory over cups of something that was technically coffee but barely, for the apartment with the granite countertops that they had argued about for 3 weeks before choosing, for the airball games on weekends, for the showers after, for the way Kale had leaned down and whispered things that made her laugh and then grab his hand and pull him toward the door. All of it gone. 3,000 years gone, and the world had forgotten, had chosen to forget, had built a new civilization on the bones of the old one, and called it progress, and called the old one legend, and moved on. She wept until she could not, and then she washed her face at the basin, and then she sat on the bed, and then she made a decision. She could not stay here, not because Brahm and Mara were unkind, because they were kind, they were patient. They had taken in a stranger who spoke no language, who had no money, who had no explanation, and they had fed her and housed her and given her time. And she loved them for it in the way you love someone who has been gentle with you when you were too broken to be gentle with yourself. But they could not give her what she needed, which was information, context, a map of the world as it was now, the political landscape, the power structures, the location of the Forsaken if they were still alive, the state of the One Power, the state of the seal on the Dark One's prison, and none of that existed in a village of 40 houses at the edge of a valley where the biggest news of the week was a goat escaping into a cabbage. She needed a city, a real city, a place where people knew things, where records existed, where the White Tower's influence could be felt and measured and understood, and Camelin was the name Bram had spoken with. Reverence. The capital of Andor, the nearest true city, 2 weeks south on foot, or 3 days by horse if the roads were good. Sarah had no horse, had no money, had no identity, had no command of the language beyond the basics, had no understanding of the customs or the laws or the social structures of this world. But she had 11 years of training in the One Power far beyond anything this era could produce. She had a physicist's mind, and she had the stubborn, furious refusal to die that had kept her alive through 6 hours of combat. Against 3 Forsaken, and it would have to be enough. She told Bram and Mara the next morning at breakfast, simply, directly, without preamble. I need to go south, to Camelin. I need to find answers. I cannot stay here, and I am putting you at risk by staying. Bram frowned. Mara nodded slowly, and the silence stretched between them like a held breath. "You are not well enough," Bram said. "I am well enough. You do not know the roads. You do not know the people. You speak the tongue like a child." "Then I will learn as I go." Mara set down her mortar, wiped her hands on her apron, looked at Sarah with those sharp, assessing eyes, and asked the question that mattered. "You will come back?" Sarah considered the question, considered the village, the wooden house, the straw mattress, the bowl of broth, the two people who had pulled her out of the grass and given her 9 days of silence and patience. And she
Said if I can, and she meant it.
Mara nodded, reached under the table, produced a small leather pouch and set it on the table between them. "Coins, not many. Enough for a room in a town, enough for food for 3 days, and after that you will need to find work or find answers quickly." Sarah stared at the pouch, stared at Mara, swallowed the lump in her throat. "Thank you. Do not thank me. Come back. That is payment enough." The walk south took 11 days. Sarah had expected it to take longer, but her body was stronger than she had given it credit for, because 6 hours of combat against 3 Forsaken had not been her first physical trial. The war of power had lasted 3 years. She had marched and run and fought and carried wounded comrades through mud and fire, and her body remembered, even if her mind wanted to forget. The landscape was green and gentle, rolling hills and fields of grain and small clusters of houses every few miles, farmsteads and hamlets with people who looked at her with mild curiosity and no suspicion. A woman walking alone on the road, unusual but not alarming, and she kept her head down and her pace steady and spoke when spoken to and did not linger. She practiced the language as she walked, murmuring words to herself, constructing sentences, testing verb conjugations against the patterns she had observed in Brahmamara's speech, making mistakes, correcting them, making new mistakes, and she listened to the world around her, to the creak of cartwheels, the lowing of cattle, the shout of a farmer driving his animals, the singing of a child somewhere out of sight, and beneath it, all the silence of a world without engines, without electricity, without the hum of infrastructure, just wood and iron and the sound of human voices and the wind in the grain. She walked and thought and planned, because Camelin would have records, would have scholars, would have some knowledge of the age of legends, however distorted, would have information about the White Tower and the Forsaken and the state of the world, and Camelin would have a Sedai, real ones, the ones of this age, the ones who called themselves servants of all, and then gentled men and meddled in king's affairs and called it service. Sarah would need to deal with them, would need to navigate them, would need to understand their politics and their hierarchies and their rules, would need to hide what she was until she understood the landscape well. Enough to reveal it safely, or perhaps not hide, perhaps reveal, perhaps walk into the nearest Aes Sedai office and say, "I am Sarah Vielle, I am 3,000 years old, I am from the age of legends, I was a physicist and a soldier, and a woman who loved a man who is now dust, and I need to know what happened to the world." No, too dangerous, too soon. She did not know the rules yet, did not know the players, did not know who could be trusted and who could not, and so she would watch first, listen first, learn the shape of the board before she made her first move. Camelin rose from the plain like a challenge. Sarah saw it from a ridge 2 miles out, the walls white stone and impossibly tall, stretching in both directions until they curved out of sight, with towers and spires and domes rising behind them, and the city was vast, larger than she had expected from Brahm's descriptions, larger than any settlement she had seen in 11 days of walking, and it was not Adanza, not Komel Adanzan, not any of the great cities she had known, because there were no crystal spires, no floating platforms, no light rail threading between towers, no hum of the grid, no sense of a civilization that had mastered its own environment. But it was something. It was a city. It had walls and streets and buildings and people. It had records and institutions and the accumulated knowledge of 3,000 years of rebuilding. And it would do. Sarah walked down from the ridge and toward the gate, and the gate guard asked her name, and she gave one, not her own, not yet, a name she had constructed on the walk south, simple and unremarkable, a name that belonged to this world and this time and this place. And the guard looked at her clothes which Mara had given her, plain wool, undyed, functional, at her hands which were still too smooth and too uncalloused, at her accent which was still too flat and too wrong. And he asked where she was from, and she said the north, a village, small, no name worth remembering, and his eyes lingered, and then he waved her through. Caemlyn swallowed her. The streets narrow and crowded, stone buildings 3 and 4 stories tall, leaning over the lanes, market stalls and carts and animals and people shouting and haggling and arguing and laughing, and the smell of cooking meat and open drains and unwashed bodies and horse dung. And Sarah walked and looked and listened and catalogued, because the architecture was stone and timber with no metal framing. The roads were cobblestone, uneven, slick with something she did not want to identify. The lighting was oil lamps and candles. The heating was wood fires, and the plumbing was, from the smell, minimal. 3,000 years, and they had rebuilt this. She found an inn, small, cheap, a room at the top of a narrow staircase with a window that faced a brick wall, and the innkeeper was a broad woman with flour on her apron and a suspicious eye, and Sarah paid with 2 of Mara's coins, and the woman bit one, nodded, tossed a key on the counter, and the room was small. A bed, a chair, a wash basin, a candle, the sheets smelling of lye and old sweat, the mattress stuffed with something that had once been straw and was now mostly deuce. Sarah sat on the bed and breathed, and decided that tomorrow she would start asking questions. Tomorrow she would begin the slow work of mapping this world. Tomorrow she would find out what had happened to the Forsaken and to the Seal and to the One Power and to everything she had known. But tonight she slept. She lasted 3 days in Caemlyn before the Aes Sedai found her. She had been careful, had kept her head down, had asked questions in markets and taverns and the quiet corners of bookshops, had learned the shape of the city, the location of the palace, the location of the White Tower, embassy, the names of the players, the factions, the tensions. And she had learned that the Queen of Andor was on the throne, that the White Tower had an ambassador here named Elaida, that Elaida was powerful and ambitious and not known for her patience. And she had learned that the Forsaken were a legend, a story told to frighten children. 13 of the most powerful channelers from the Age of Legends sealed away with the dark. 1, when the dragon had ended the war, sealed, not dead, sealed, and the seal was weakening. Everyone knew that. Everyone whispered it. No one spoke it aloud. And on the 3rd day, in a market square, in the middle of a conversation with a bookseller about the history of the breaking, Sarah felt it. A touch on Sedar, light, probing, testing, someone reaching for her connection to the power, gently and carefully, the way you might poke a sleeping animal to see if it was alive. Sarah went still, did not look up, did not react, let the probe wash over her, because she had dampened her connection, drawn it in tight, made herself small, and the probe found nothing and moved on. But Sarah knew someone in this city could channel. Someone had felt the faintest whisper of Sedar around her and had come to investigate. She left the market, walked quickly without running because running drew attention, turned corners, doubled back, found an alley, pressed against the wall, and breathed. And a second probe came, closer, more focused. Someone narrowing, coming closer. And Sarah dropped her dampening entirely and let Sedar flood through her. Let the light blaze around her. Because if they were coming, they would find her. And she would not be caught small, would not be caught hiding, would not be caught weak. The woman appeared at the end of the alley, tall, dark-haired, handsome rather than pretty, with a face that was cold and severe and accustomed to obedience, wearing a dress of deep red cut in a style Sarah did not recognize, a shawl over her shoulders, a ring on her finger, and she looked at Sarah, And Sarah looked at her, and the woman spoke. You are channeling in the streets of Camelin without permission, without registration, without the consent of the White Tower. Sarah straightened, did not lower her guard, did not release Sedai. I am not subject to the White Tower. The woman's eyes narrowed and something flickered across her face. Not surprise, not fear, but anger, cold and controlled and institutional. The anger of someone who has never been told no, who has never been questioned, who has never been refused. You are subject to the law, and the law says that any woman who can channel must be tested, registered, and trained or gentled. Those are the options, there are no others. Sarah felt her jaw tighten, felt the old anger rise, the anger of the battlefield, the anger of 3,000 years, the anger of a world that had taken everything she knew and called it progress, and then made her register for the crime of existing. I will not be tested. I will not be registered. I will not be trained by people who have forgotten what the power is for. I will not be gentled. I am not a threat. I am not a child. I am not yours to command. The woman's expression did not change, but her hand moved, a subtle shift of weight, a flex of fingers, and Sarah felt it. The gathering of Sedai, the formation of a web, and the woman was going to attack. And Sarah moved first. She struck with air, a blunt flat wave of compressed wind aimed not at the woman's body, but at her feet, at her balance, at her ability to stand and weave and fight. And the woman stumbled and recovered and struck. Back with fire, a lance of flame, white hot, and aimed at Sarah's chest. And Sarah sidestepped and wove a shield of air and deflected the fire into the alley wall, where the stone blackened and cracked, and the heat washed over her face. The woman was good, better than Sarah had expected from this era. Fast, precise, her weaves tight and controlled and efficient. Not elegant, not beautiful, but effective. The product of training and discipline and decades of practice. But she was not Age of Legends. She was not War of Power. She was not a woman who had fought for 6 hours against 3 Forsaken and lived. Sarah ended it, splitting her flows into 30 threads of Sedai, each one thin as a hair and precise as a surgeon's cut. 20 wrapping around the woman's body, pinning her arms and legs and torso. 5 forming a shield around her connection to the power, cutting her off from Sedai. 5 pressing against the ground, anchoring her in place, and the woman hit the cobblestones hard, her head cracking against the stone, gasping, trying to move, unable, trying to channel, unable, staring up at Sarah with eyes full of fury and disbelief. Sarah stood over her, breathing hard, hands steady, Sedai blazing around her like a crown. I told you, she said quietly, without anger now. Just fact. I am not yours. I am not the Tower's. I am not anyone's. I was old when your institution was young. I was trained when your ancestors were still learning to light fires. You do not get to put your hands on me. You do not get to gentle me. You do not get to decide what I am. The woman stared up, blood trickling from her scalp, her jaw working, and she asked, Who are you? And Sarah considered the question, considered the answer, considered the world she was standing in. 3,000 years, from home, with no allies, no resources, no map, and a woman at her feet who would remember this, who would come looking, who would bring others. No one, Sarah said, no one you need to worry about. Stay down, stay quiet, forget you saw me. And she released the weave, stepped back, turned, walked out of the alley and into the street and into the crowd and did not look back. She left Camelin the next morning before dawn, before the city woke, before the woman could organize a search, before the tower could send someone, before the machine could grind into motion and find her and pin her down and demand answers she was not ready to give. She had a horse now, bought in the dark from a stable boy who did not ask questions, a brown mare with a mean temperament and a rolling gait that made Sarah's stomach turn, and she rode south, then west, then south again, doubling back, cutting across fields, avoiding roads, avoiding towns, avoiding people, and the horse was miserable, and Sarah was miserable, and the saddle was a device designed by someone who hated the human spine, and the roads were mud, and the sky was gray, and the wind was cold. She rode and thought and planned, because the woman in the alley was Elida. Sarah had heard the name in the market, knew what it meant, knew the weight it carried. And Elida would not forget, would not forgive, would search. And Elida would tell the tower, and the tower would listen, and the tower would come. Sarah needed allies, needed information, needed a base, needed time, needed a plan. And she had none of those things. She had a horse, a pouch of coins, a command of the language that was improving daily, a connection to Sedai that was stronger than anyone in this era could match, and the knowledge burning in her chest like a coal that the Forsaken were still alive, that the seal was weakening, that the dragon was reborn, that the world, walking toward a war it did not know it was already losing. She rode, and the wind pressed against her face, and the horse's hooves beat a steady rhythm on the dirt road, and the fields stretched in both directions, green and empty and endless, and Sedai rode south, away from Camelin, away from Elida, away from the woman who had tried to pin her to the ground and call her subject, and call her threat, and call her property. She rode toward whatever came next, as she did not know what that was, not yet, but she knew it was coming. The world was turning, the wheel was spinning, the pattern was weaving itself into shapes she could not yet see, and she was in it, whether she wanted to be or not, whether she was ready or not, whether she belonged here or not, she was in it. The horse walked on, the sun moved, the field stretched, and behind her, in a city of white stone, a woman with blood on her scalp was already sending messages, already calling in favors, already setting the machine in motion. And the hunt had begun, and Sarah did not know it yet, but she would, soon enough.